Thank you. First of all, I would like to welcome two community members, Camille Baruch and Eugene Miller. We're glad you could both be here. And our auditor, Chris Choliak. Thank you so much, and I will turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate you having me today. It's nice to finally see everybody's faces in person. Yeah, I've seen there's been a lot of screen time over the last couple of months, so nice to actually see everybody. Now, as a whole, how do we want to go through the audited financial statement highlights? Oh, perfect. We've got them up. I was going to say I can throw them up, but we can keep it simple.
Just give.
To get it full.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks, everybody. So today I'll go through a brief of the audited financial statements as a whole, touching on a quick summary of changes from budget changes from last year. If there's any questions at all, please shout them out as we go. If I don't have a note right in front of me on what it is, I will jot it down, or maybe Nick can jump in on the phone or otherwise to help clarify. But just so everybody is aware, so just as a very fast status update, so we would have met with the Audit and Finance Committee Friday of last week. Yeah, the days are all blending together at this point, but Friday of last week to review the draft financial statements as well as our audit findings report. From that date, there's been no changes from the initial drafts as discussed. So I'm going to go through again the financial statements as a whole, just on a summarized basis. And as I mentioned, if there's any questions, please shout them out. I prefer this to be an engaged process. It just makes it seem like everybody in the room is actually paying attention and not falling asleep when the auditor's talking. So before I jump actually past this page, I will very quickly just on the audit report itself, just speak to the very first paragraph that is going to be just up a little bit, the 2 pages, 1 page up, and I won't go through this report as a whole. The only thing I will quickly speak to is the second paragraph there, which is our opinion paragraph, which is to say we have an unqualified or clean audit opinion. So kudos again to the finance team, to the administration team as a whole. We've got a clean audit opinion for this year. So I'll quickly read it out. In our opinion, the accompanying financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the school division at August 31st, 2023, results of its operations, remeasurement gains and losses, changes in net financial assets and cash flows in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. So that is a very accountant and wordy way of saying we've got a clean audit opinion. Now, the rest of the audit reports, I won't go through in detail. It's going to be, from a formatting perspective, very similar to what you would have seen in the past, but really the rest of the paragraphs just speak to that these are your financial statements. They're compiled and in the format as required by Alberta Education, but all the underlying financial information within is based on the school division's financial statements. So quickly, jumping now into the statement of financial position, or a kind of balance sheet, really, where did the school division end up on August 31st, 2023? So that's going to be on the left-hand side, 2022 on the right-hand side. And just for clarification, there are, if you scroll up just a half a click, maybe a little bit, touch more. Just to the, we're going to go up a little bit more just so I can see the column header. Sorry. So, yeah, sure. There we go. Perfect. So under the 2022 column header there, we see restated. And there are a couple of restatements within these financial statements. So one, as a result of the adoption of the new accounting standard asset retirement obligations. So this is the capturing of the asbestos reclamation costs and other associated costs of asbestos and other reclamation at the various school level. And this is applied what I call retroactively. So effectively, since the asbestos standards came into effect in about 1996, there's some historical change to the financial statements as a result of this, and then some future change as well. And so part of that restatement is a result of the asset retirement obligations. And then there's two other changes identified just through the audit process as a whole. One of them, neither of them impact reserves or accumulated surplus in any way, but they really just, I would say, revalue capital assets a little bit more appropriately. So one of them is that schools were being depreciated over 25 years instead of a longer life cycle. Schools are going to last probably significantly more than 25 years, especially in this day and age. Alberta Education provides guidance in around 50 years. So we've just modified the life of the schools to be depreciated over a 50-year period instead of 25 years. And then the only other change on there is specifically in regards to the St. Andre Academy, which was built through the unique E3 funding model with the province. And with that funding model, there's a monthly maintenance charge that's paid not directly by STAR, but actually by Alberta Infrastructure on STAR's behalf. And that maintenance charge had been picked up and capitalized over the last 8 or so years in and added to the cost of the building, whereas it should have been just expensed over time. Now, it offsets with the what I call spent deferred capital, the offsetting deferral. So there's no change in operating reserves whatsoever, but it's reduced the value of the St. Andre School to the tune of about $1.7 million. So that those two, the change in the life of the schools increased the value by about $9 million, offset by that change specifically for the maintenance contract of about $1.7 million. So the value of the schools or capital assets as a whole on a restated basis. So if you looked at the tangible capital assets to last year's financial statements compared to this year in the restated or 2022 column, they're going to be about $8 million higher.
That is this. The deal.
So that's quickly the restatement itself. Just going through, we can see financial assets this year, cash or will become cash in the future, are $6.2 million, down about $900,000 over last year, really with the drawdown being the cash balance. And one of the stories for the year within these financial statements is that the province has implemented or put in a cap on reserves and unrestricted surplus funds that are allowed to be carried forward on a go-forward basis. So that drawdown of the cash was intentional and budgeted because this brings the school division kind of right up to or just slightly under what the allowable cap is from the province for Alberta Education. And then just scroll up a little perfect. Liabilities then, $3.1 million, down from $2.9 million last year. So, excuse me, up from $2.9 million last year, sorry. And when we see on a composition basis, overall, the overall balance is relatively comparable. Accounts payable have come down a little bit over last year, and that's just timing related to when invoices are paid at the end of the month compared to when checks were cut after the end of the fiscal year. Offset partially by the new row on there, and I will highlight the new row, asset retirement obligations and environmental liabilities. So comparatively looking at last year's financial statements, this row wouldn't exist, and this is the result of that new change in accounting standards. And this is effectively the ongoing or the future costs of remediation and reclamation at the school levels as a whole. So we can see it's just under $2 million this year compared to just over $1.7 million this year. That is actually a result of some of the reclamation and remediation done through the Father Lacombe School as it was kind of demolished and reclaimed throughout the year. Those costs have actually come down. So the 1.7 million reflects kind of the future costs at the individual schools across the school division's kind of school portfolio. And generally, these are going to be typically funded in the future through either future modernizations or upgrades from Alberta Education. So total liabilities just under $3.1 million. So we've got financial assets of $6.2 million minus the liabilities of $3.1 million. You've got non-financial assets. So what I say is cash available if you paid off all your bills of $3.1 million at the end of August 2023. And you add to that your non-financial assets, for the most part being capital purchases, capital assets. So tangible capital assets, $87 million, relatively comparable to last year. And really this is additions in the year. So the Father Lacombe construction being the big one, offset by annual depreciation or amortization on the various schools and other assets as a whole. So down slightly as a result of that. Inventories, very consistent. This is just school inventories held for supplies and other things at the various schools, and prepaid expenses, again, very consistent, no significant changes. So total non-financial assets of $87.2 million, down slightly from the $87.9 million last year. Really, that is the annual depreciation or amortization on the various school and other equipment and bus portfolio that the school division holds. So if we had the financial assets of $3.1 million plus the non-financial assets of $87.2 million, you've got total net assets or total assets minus or before provincial funding of $90.3 million. And then we have spent deferred capital contributions. And that's I would say a wordy way of saying these are provincial funds provided for either school construction, other capital asset construction, or other purposes. Really, these are funds either provided directly from Alberta Education or funds paid by Alberta Infrastructure to build the schools on the school division's behalf. And these are kept separately because these kind of are depreciated over time consistently with schools so that there's no major swing to surpluses or deficits at the school level. So as there's a depreciation expense, there's an offsetting kind of revenue that offset each other over time over the life of the schools. So those spent deferred capital contributions, just under $82 million, about $1 million down over last year, which is really the depreciation that we can see over time as a result of the recognition of those funds. So spent deferred capital contributions, you're left with, net assets before minus those spent deferred capital, you're left with net assets overall of $8.5 million, about $300,000 higher than last year. Any questions on this page before I jump into the next? Seeing them. So again, this next page is a statement of operations. This is kind of the income statement, or what I like to say, what happened in the year? How did, what happened throughout the fiscal year? The story of STAR for the year ended August 31st, 2022. So the column on the left is the budget. So this is going to be the original budget. This would be the May 2022 budget that was passed. It doesn't adjust for enrollment figures for the September budget, and this is a public sector specific requirement. It's always the original budget that has to be in the financial statements. The column in the middle is the actual results for the year. So September 2022 to August 2023, and then the column on the right hand side is last year for comparative purposes. So we can see in total revenue of $53.1 million, about $3 million higher than what was originally budgeted. And where that kind of variance or difference comes from, about $1.2 million is a direct result of what I would call the weighted moving average funding model. So this is the province's new funding model that came into effect last year or 2 years ago, that looks at the trailing enrollment. So 3 years of trailing enrollment and adjusts what's available for revenue or funding on an annual basis. So that based on that trailing enrollment, there's actually $1.2 million more funding for the province available this year. Under the federal government side, there's some specific funds for Jordan's principal dollars, what I would call the First Nations Equitable Contribution Funds that have come through for the year. And then fees and sales of services, we see both bigger increases, especially compared to budget. With, well, the positive story being this is kind of the COVID recovery, the final solid year finding the COVID recovery. Field trips are returning, school learning facilities are opening. You know, some of the impact of some of the COVID closures have eroded, and now this is back into what things would have been like historically, from a fee and sales perspective, I would say. And finally, donations, other revenues, relatively trivial. Other revenues really are just actually gains on sales or disposals of buses throughout the year. So uniquely over the last couple of years, when capital assets, specifically buses, are being sold, they're actually being sold with some value to them. Whereas 4 or 5 years ago, there was very limited value at the bus level when they were being sold. So there's actually some gains on some of the sales of the buses throughout the year. So total revenue this year, $53.1 million. Then we look, where were the funds spent? In total, expenses of $52.8 million, about $1.5 million over what was originally budgeted. And so we can see revenues are about $3 million over budget, or higher than budget. Expenses about $1.5 million higher than what was originally budgeted. And for the most part, the story really is under what I would call the instructional framework. Grades 1 through 12, expenses of $38.2 million compared to the original budget of $36.8 million. And this is a result directly of some of the additional funds received from the province throughout the year, the weighted moving average, as well as some unique funding models and things provided, like curriculum support, some fuel contingency dollars, just some things that were uniquely provided by Alberta Education that weren't anticipated in the original budget. And as a result, there's some additional spending this year that offsets some of the revenue. But down the line, outside of grade 1 through 12 or instructional funds, operations, maintenance, transportation, system admin, and external services, all very consistent with budget. So really, some extra dollars in from the province and from the federal government for educational supports, with that money being spent on education supports, instructional supports. So grade 1 through 12 instruction. So if we have the revenue of $53.1 million, less the expenses of $52.8 million, you have a surplus for the year of $315,000 compared to the deficit that was originally planned or budgeted, a drawdown in funds of $1.1 million. So you started the year with $8.2 million in net assets, and then you finished the year adding that $315,000 to $8.5 million in net assets. And finally, I will cap it off. I'm not going to go through these statements detail by detail, but I will quickly jump to it's page number 10, the schedule number 1, the schedule of net assets, which just breaks down that $8.5 million into a couple specific categories. And very quickly, I will touch on, there's a lot of information on this page, but I'm just going to speak to a couple of the rows in particular. So the very first or top row, we can see that this would have been the net assets we would have had in last year's financial statements. So $9.3 million, kind of broken up between about $4 million in capital assets that the school division owned and paid for without Alberta Ed funds. So, excuse me, own source funds. $1.5 million in unrestricted funds, $2.6 million specifically in operating reserves, and $1.2 million in capital reserves. With the adoption of the asset retirement obligations, so that's the, reflecting the cost of asbestos and things in the schools. The way I describe it is the value of the assets or the schools that you have kind of come down to the tune of about $1 million, reflecting the cost of asbestos and things, the historical cost within them. So at the beginning of the year, after that adjustment, you've got $8.2 million in net assets, being just under $3 million in capital assets that you own, and then $1.5 million in unrestricted surpluses, 2.6 in operating reserves, and 1.2 in capital. So no changes to the operating reserves or capital. But then we scroll to the very bottom, which is gonna be what I'll describe as the end of the year. And so at the end of the year, net assets are $8.5 billion. Broken down by about $3.1 million in capital assets, so fairly consistent, no significant changes, no major, asset purchases that weren't supported by Alberta Education or Infrastructure. $540,000 in unrestricted surpluses, so this is kind of what I mentioned, the intentional drawdown of last year's surplus funds, that cash balance that was drawn down. $2.1 million in operating reserves and $2.7 million in capital reserves. And so when Alberta Ed looks at this, they look at the unrestricted surplus of $540,000 plus the operating reserves of just under $2.1 million. They add those up together and they subtract what you're holding specifically for school generated funds on behalf of the schools. So that's in total, those add up to about 2.6 million minus about $700,000 in school generated funds, leaves you with what I would call available operating reserves and unrestricted reserves of $1.9 million. And the cap this year is just under 2 million. So effectively, you're carrying forward almost as much as the maximum amount that is allowed by the province. So from an operational perspective, kudos to the administration and finance team for, quite frankly, drawing funds down as much as is reasonable, really to get just under that threshold as defined that is allowed to be carried forward from Alberta Education. Now that's the financials. That's me rattling on. Any questions or details that I specifically didn't cover within these that anybody has questions on?
Chris, I should have asked you this the other day, but I'm interested in the fact that the investment income was budgeted for 40,000 and you ended up with almost 300. So
Great, but thank you. Sorry, I'm independent member.
member of the public.
Member of the, everybody's got a different name. Great question. Story of the year, probably no surprise to anybody. Interest rates skyrocketed. Specifically, interest rates started climbing roughly January of 2022, but really starting in about May of 2022 all the way through to September of 2023. Interest rates, the prime rate went from 2% to 7.5%, 7.2%. So the bank account that the school division has actually has an interest rate that fluctuates with prime. So with the increase in interest rates based on the cash balance on hand, there's just some additional interest being earned on the cash balance on hand, which is probably contrary to the last nearly 10 years that you would have seen in the financial statements where there was literally nearly no interest earned at any one point because of the what I call historically low interest rates. So with those interest rates were so low, there was almost no interest being paid on the balance of the cash account. Or balance of the bank account. Thank you. Any other questions? Thanks. Fantastic. That's the financial statements as a whole, summary recap. Before we pass it up, I really do want to give, I mentioned this in the Audit and Finance Committee, but this is the first year that we're here as auditors. A transition year is always a lot more work, both to the finance team, the finance staff as a whole. I really want to give kudos across the board. And thanks to everybody that was involved through the process. You know, it's never an easy transition process, and I realize it takes a lot of time and effort on everybody's behalf, but we're here today on schedule, so kudos. Thanks to everybody on the finance team.
I would like to thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you very much.
Thank sorry. We want to thank our two public people. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Eugene Miller and Camille Gould. Thank you for all your hard work. All those meetings, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
Have a good Christmas, everyone.
You as well.
Okay, you as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Do you need to take a few minutes? Take a 5-minute break and maybe. So.